In Star Wars, it was a symbol of the Rebel Alliance, a starfighter that Luke Skywalker used to blow up the Death Star, and an iconic piece of machinery. It stood for rebellion, for fighting against oppressors, for destroying the evil empire that wants to take over the galaxy. We're talking, of course, about the X-Wing. And how fitting it is that a drone that Ukraine is about to receive has been given the same name. Where the X-Wing played a vital role for the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars, this insane experimental weapon that Lithuania just gave Ukraine will leave Russia shocked and its soldiers terrified. Military was among the first to report on this bold new weapon. On October 9th, the outlet said that the Lithuanian defense company Granta Autonomy has officially unveiled a new loitering munition called the X-Wing. A vertical takeoff and landing or VTOL drone, the X-Wing has undergone extensive testing since the spring of 2025, with Granta Autonomy stating that its key capabilities are confirmed as ready to go. And that new drone is heading to Ukraine. A small series of X-Wings is currently being manufactured and delivered for additional trials to frontline units of the armed forces of Ukraine, Granta Autonomy founder and CEO Guoba told Military. Continuous operational use at the front is being used as part of the system's validation. In other words, Granta has taken its new drone as far as it can with laboratory testing. It now needs to prove itself in combat. And having Ukraine deploy this experimental drone is the perfect way to determine how effective it can be against an enemy that Lithuania believes may soon pose as much of a threat to its territory as it does to Ukraine. United 24 media also reported on the incoming X-Wing, noting that the initial deployment of this experimental drone will be limited. However, Granta is working on building up to mass production, assuming the combat testing about to be carried out by Ukraine proves successful. By the beginning of next year, Granta expects to have scaled up to the point where it's producing several hundred of these interesting airframes per month. If everything goes as Granta and Ukraine hope it will go, then 2026 may become the year that Ukraine is able to use a weapon that carries a very symbolic name to fight back against a nation that seems bent on domination. But first, Ukraine needs to find out if the X-Wing lives up to its billing. And at first glance, Lithuania's new drone seems like a very impressive piece of kit. The basics come from Military, which says that the drone is interesting because it combines the VTOL capabilities of a typical quadcopter drone with cruise flight that is enabled by its X-shaped wings. The ability to cruise means that the X-Wing can travel over greater distances using less energy in cruise mode compared with other small unmanned aerial vehicles Ukraine is using against Russia. Cruising capability also means that drone operators will gain the ability to fire on Russian targets without requiring any sort of special infrastructure. As for technical specifications, Guoba offers one of the most important. An endurance range of 50 kilometers is the initial specification, which will be improved. However, we will consistently balance the extended capabilities of the X-Wing with its production cost, Guoba told Military in October. That amounts to about 31 miles, which is over twice the 12-mile range of the average FPV drone, per an October 9th Forbes article. The X-Wing won't be limited by fiber optic cables either, which gives it a clear advantage over those kinds of drones. Plus, pay attention to what Guoba said, 50 kilometers is the baseline. Further development will follow the testing phase that is about to take place in Ukraine, meaning later versions of the X-Wing will be able to travel even further. Lithuania may have just handed Ukraine a drone that could change the entire complexion of the battlefield. Medium-range strikes conducted from relative safety could now be possible. At the farthest edge of its range, an X-Wing could strike a Russian target while leaving its operators with plenty of time to evacuate before a Russian response can arrive. Beyond that, we know that the drone can carry an explosive payload weighing about 4 kilograms, which is roughly equivalent to 8.8 pounds. It's also pretty fast, capable of reaching speeds of up to 144 kilometers or 89 miles per hour. That speed is important. Slow-moving drones are vulnerable to everything from air defenses to small arms fire. A drone that rockets along at almost 90 miles per hour is very difficult to hit, especially if it's flying so low to the ground that air defense radars aren't able to pick up on its presence. Other important features include a combination of daytime optics and a thermal imager, making the drones usable 24 hours per day. That capability comes from Granta's micro-gimbal camera, which has also been built to continue operating in environments where global navigation systems have been denied or jammed. So an X-Wing operator can maintain control at all times, regardless of the many electronic warfare tricks that Russia attempts to pull from its sleeve. We also can't ignore the Granta data link communication system. Granta has already ensured that this system is capable of communicating directly with the standard ground stations currently used in Ukraine. The base version of the X-Wing also makes use of some artificial intelligence or AI. Its guidance system incorporates some AI elements that allow it to identify and target camouflaged assets on the ground. This combination of features makes the X-Wing a nightmare for Russia's forces. What Ukraine is about to receive is an experimental drone that combines speed and agility to make it capable of evading Russia's countermeasures. The warhead employed by the drone is also versatile thanks to its fragmentation properties. That means Ukraine can use the X-Wing to tackle personnel, lightly armored vehicles, and even radar stations. The latter would allow Ukraine to enjoy the ultimate irony of taking out the eyes of the very systems that are supposed to be shooting its drones out of the sky. The X-Wing nightmare will get even worse for Russia in the future. Granta says that it's currently working on introducing full swarm autonomy via a mesh network to its drones. With that technology in place, Ukraine would gain the ability to launch full swarms of X-Wings that can operate independently of human interference and in tandem with other X-Wing drones that are connected to the same network. Swarm technology utilizes AI in far more interesting and devastating ways than simply empowering a drone to identify hidden targets. The Wall Street Journal has reported on this emerging tech, claiming that it's the next frontier of drone warfare because of the sheer amount of potential that swarms offer. In theory, a swarm network could allow the user to link thousands of drones together into a single network, all of which can be used to overwhelm the defenses of a target. Even dozens in a swarm would cause major problems for Russia's soldiers. Imagine 20 or 30 X-Wing drones, all flying almost as one, though also intelligent enough to fly in a formation that makes it difficult for air defenses to take them down. Those drones are all zeroed in on a single target, and they'll fly at that target all at once and from many different angles to ensure a direct hit. That's the sort of threat that Granta wants to build into its X-Wing drones, but it isn't quite there yet. We'll dig a little deeper into the impact that drone swarms could have on the Ukraine war later in the video, but for now, we'll conclude our examination of Granta's X-Wing with a single number: 10,000 euros. That's how many euros Granta claims a single X-Wing costs to build. That translates to roughly $11,560. Which is a tiny price to pay for a drone that is capable of causing as much damage as Lithuania's experimental weapon. This price tag comes with the caveat that later versions of the drone, particularly those that incorporate swarm technology, will cost more. But for an already impressive baseline version of the X-Wing, a little over $11,000 seems like an absolute steal. It certainly compares favorably to the sorts of targets the X-Wing is designed to take out. In 2025, a single soldier costs Russia $31,200 per year, based on an October CNN estimate that a first-year contract soldier fighting in Ukraine earns about $2,600 per month. That's without counting for the lump sum that recruits receive just for signing up for Russia's military in the first place. These one-off payments can be as high as $36,560 in some regions, which is added to a $4,900 payment the soldiers get from Russia's federal government and the wages we just mentioned. An X-Wing that takes out a single Russian soldier will cost Russia over $70,000. Ukraine will spend just $11,000. And if the new drone is as effective at taking out lightly armored targets and radar systems as Granta claims it is, the cost of Russia's losses could end up in the millions for a comparatively tiny outlay on Ukraine's part. To temper all of this, it's important to reiterate that the X-Wing is still in a testing period. Though it's proven itself in the Granta labs, Ukraine still has to discover if the new drone's range of features makes it a viable asset on the battlefield. Based on what Granta has said, it seems likely that the rest of 2025 will be dedicated to combat testing the new drone, with the increased production plan for 2026 gearing up if and when the new X-Wing proves itself in Ukraine. Assuming the X-Wing is everything that Granta claims it to be, it's going to have some interesting company on the battlefield. For one, there's a drone that Ukraine itself has built that bears a striking resemblance to Lithuania's experimental drone. Dubbed the Flycat, this drone was unveiled by Octava Defense in July, and it features similar capabilities to Granta's drone. These include the ability to loiter autonomously, identify targets, and conduct kamikaze strikes, all without relying on any form of satellite navigation. The warhead is a little smaller in this Ukrainian X-Wing drone, and the Flycat is also a touch slower and has a shorter range. Still, the combination of these two drones will be the last thing Russia's forces would want to see on the battlefield. United 24 also reports that Ukraine has just completed a successful test of its new Zhuk drone, just days before Granta announced that the X-Wing will be arriving in Ukraine. Also a fixed-wing loitering drone, though with a more conventional design than the X-Wing, the Zhuk has managed to hit targets at distances exceeding 40 kilometers while wading through a host of electrical interference. That's the point. The drone, which was designed by a company called Autonomy, was made specifically to counter Russia's electronic warfare countermeasures. One test of the Zhuk saw it reach a target 67 kilometers or 41 miles away, showcasing that Ukraine is just as capable of developing loitering munitions as its partners. Not that any of this means that Ukraine doesn't want Granta's X-Wing. Rather, the point we're making here is that these drones indicate several trends that are leading Ukraine to the next evolution of its drone warfare strategy. It's not just about sheer numbers anymore, though having many more drones on the battlefield than Russia is still extremely important. These drones showcase a focus on overcoming electronic countermeasures to ensure the drones hit their targets no matter how hard Russia tries to jam their signals. We're also seeing a shift toward autonomous target detection and striking, which makes a drone operator's job a lot easier. Plus, all three of these drones have impressive ranges, with the X-Wing coming out on top, which could allow Ukraine to deploy them behind frontline positions so it can strike Russia in the near rear. The X-Wing is just a part of a burgeoning drone evolution in Ukraine, and its arrival means several bad things for Russia. The potential for Ukraine to start using drone swarms is one of those bad things, albeit one that isn't going to arrive immediately, given that Granta is still developing swarm technology for the X-Wing. Once that technology is in place, Russia will have a serious problem on its hands. We've already touched on why when discussing swarm technology earlier, but it's worth exploring what drone swarms really mean for the Ukraine war. For one thing, swarming allows Ukraine to do something similar to Russia's human wave assaults, only using drones. Forces News spoke to David Hambling in September 2025, who explained an interesting use case for this kind of technology. The attack drones will then come in as a swarm, and between them, they will work out which drones attack which target, so they don't all go with the same target, Hambling says. Immediately we see a key benefit. Ukraine's operators don't have to waste time figuring out what to hit because the AI that powers the swarm does all of that work for them. Less time spent by Ukraine also means less time for Russia to react to incoming drones, which will amount to more effective strikes against multiple targets. Hambling continues, and so you get one drone attacking each target in the first wave. After that, the reconnaissance drones will assess the damage, and then follow-up drones will be assigned to anything that's not destroyed, until all of the targets have been taken out, and the human commander just needs to verify that and say, "Job done, you can return home," he says. It's here where we see the emulation of Russia's human wave tactics come into play. For Putin, human life is expendable enough that he's willing to send wave after wave of soldiers into the meat grinder to destroy a target. Attrition is the goal, but the human cost is immense. With drone swarms, Ukraine can conduct the same kind of assaults using machines instead of people. Multiple waves attack, with each wave following up on what the wave before did. Even if Russia manages to fend off the waves, Ukraine simply loses drones. It doesn't lose people. That's pretty important to Ukraine because, as Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reported in August, Ukraine is dealing with a creeping soldier shortage. The outlet reports on figures provided by Poland's Center for Eastern Studies, or OSW, which says that Ukraine needs to recruit 300,000 soldiers annually to replenish the losses its brigades have experienced. Ukraine isn't hitting that number. It recruited 200,000 in 2024 and was recruiting between 17 and 24,000 people per month by August 2025. Even at the high end of that range, that amounts to 288,000 recruits, 12,000 shy of the number OSW says Ukraine needs to hit. Drone swarms, along with Ukraine's other unmanned vehicles, may make it so that such heavy recruitment is no longer a necessity. Autonomous drones that can act independently minimize the need for Ukraine to field as many soldiers. That's not to say that drones will replace humans, however, they can certainly fill in the gaps left over by 3.5 years of intense warfare, allowing Ukraine to launch assaults and maintain defenses without risking as many of its people. A lower casualty rate also means that Ukraine doesn't have to recruit as many soldiers. We also can't ignore the impact that the X-Wing will have on Russia, even without its upcoming swarm capabilities. Even the base model is designed to be a death-dealing machine, and Russia could use far less death as it tries to maintain the strength of its assaults against Ukraine. This is a country that has already lost more than 1.12 million people to death, injury, or capture, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, and its drones that are doing more direct damage to Russia than any other weapon. By April 2025, drones were reported to be the cause of up to 80% of all casualties in the Ukraine war. Army technology used Russia's casualty figures from April 8th to highlight what this means, noting that drones would have been responsible for 1,000 of the 1,300 losses Russia experienced on that day alone. The sheer number of drones that now roam the Ukrainian battlefield has made it so that there is no safe space for Russia's soldiers, Hambling said on October 9th when writing for Forbes. Hambling discussed how Ukraine has done an excellent job of giving itself a choice of drones that it can use for short, medium, and long-range attacks. Lithuania's X-Wing fits into the middle category, and it will be ideal for creating kill zones in areas of Ukraine that are already occupied by Russia. Thanks to the drone's automated tracking and targeting, Ukraine just needs to deploy some X-Wing drones and leave them to do their thing while it concentrates its people on the combat lines. Any new drone adding to Ukraine's already impressive stockpiles is bad enough for Russia. However, there's also a strange phenomenon that appears to be afflicting Russia's forces right now. On October 8th, the New Voice of Ukraine reported that Russia's ratio of wounded to killed in combat has taken an abnormally high turn. The outlet shares figures published by the Institute for the Study of War, which says that Russia is losing 1 soldier to death for every 1.3 soldiers that are being wounded. The takeaway here is that Ukraine is getting more efficient at killing rather than just maiming Russia's forces. Or, given that up to 80% of casualties are being caused by drones, it's Ukraine's unmanned vehicles that are becoming more efficient. This Russian ratio is notable because a typical ratio is usually somewhere around 1 killed for every 3 injured, as the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center points out. X-Wing is designed to be a lethal drone, and that's the last thing that Russia's shocked troops want to see when so many more of them are dying. Finally, there's the fact that this drone is coming from Lithuania to consider. Granta has touched on how it's sending X-Wing drones into Ukraine for combat testing. The company doesn't say whether it's charging Ukraine for those drones, but it doesn't really matter. Even if Ukraine is paying, this transfer of technology demonstrates that Ukraine is building a stronger relationship with a Baltic nation that is very wary of what Putin might have planned if he succeeds in Ukraine. Lithuania is so wary of a future Russian invasion that officials in its capital city of Vilnius have already concocted an evacuation plan to be put into place if Putin ever manages to move beyond Ukraine. That plan, which the BBC says details how Lithuania would handle the evacuation of around 540,000 people, is in place because Vilnius is very close to the 422-mile border that Lithuania shares with Belarus. Putin used Belarus as a launchpad for his Ukraine invasion. Lithuania wants to be ready if Russia's leader tries to do the same thing in the future. Any connections that Lithuania and Ukraine forge benefit both. The latter can get access to technology like the X-Wing that it may not have the time or resources to develop itself. The former helps a country upon which it's relying to defeat Russia because Lithuania believes that it may be next if Ukraine falls. The X-Wing isn't going to win the war for Ukraine, of course, but it's yet another piece slotted into place for Ukraine's growing drone army. And when swarm technology is introduced to the drone and Granta has increased its manufacturing capabilities, X-Wing could become the stuff of nightmares for Putin's forces on the front lines in Ukraine. The situation between Russia and NATO is like a ticking time bomb. With every day that passes, something else happens to escalate tensions. Tick. Russia sends drones into NATO territory. Tock. NATO members tell Russia that it will respond to these types of actions with force. Tick. Russia sends fighter jets. Tock. NATO countries say they'll shoot these jets down. Now, that bomb is on the verge of exploding. NATO is planning a military response to Russia's hybrid warfare. Vladimir Putin isn't going to take that threat lying down. Threats coming out of the Kremlin are escalating up to and including talk about using nuclear weapons. On October 9th, the Financial Times published a report in which it said that NATO allies are discussing how to provide a more forceful response to Russia's recent provocations. Since the beginning of September, Russia has used its aerial assets to invade NATO airspace, including sending drones into Polish airspace and flying a trio of MiG-31 fighter jets into Estonia. Hybrid warfare is Russia's goal, and it's using these incidents to poke and prod at NATO, testing and threatening in equal measure to see what kind of response it's going to get. That response is coming. Putin isn't going to like it. The Financial Times says that talks between NATO members, which are currently ongoing, began as a discussion between a small group of representatives of the states that have been most directly affected by Russia's actions. Now those talks are ballooning. 2 unnamed officials who spoke to the outlet said that a much broader discussion is now taking place, as allied capitals have realized that the threats posed by Russia's hybrid warfare campaign extend beyond the borders of the affected countries. Putin is challenging NATO, and that means that NATO is going to have to take a more aggressive stance to serve as a deterrent to Russia. There are active discussions on these issues, how to better and more efficiently respond to Russia, said one of the Financial Times sources, who is noted as a NATO diplomat. The same source noted that the talks are still in their very early stages, and they come off the back of 2 emergency meetings held in September following the drone and fighter jet incursions we mentioned previously. The big question is, what is this military response going to look like? With no timeline or obligation attached to any change in NATO posture, it's difficult to say for certain. However, there are several ideas reportedly being bandied around, including the conversion of surveillance drones currently operating near the NATO border with Russia into attack drones that could intercept incoming threats. Currently, those drones are deployed to collect intelligence on what Russia is doing in those regions where its territory borders countries like Finland and the Baltic states. Arming those drones would send a clear message to Putin that any future attempts he makes to cross those borders will be met with force. It's possible that these newly armed drones could become part of the proposed drone wall that NATO is planning to create. Bloomberg reported on this wall in an October 7th article, noting that the concept is yet to be fully fleshed out but is under discussion within NATO. The idea of creating a drone wall has also started gaining momentum since Russia's hybrid warfare campaign escalated in September, the outlet says. NATO is likely to take several cues from Ukraine when creating this drone wall. Given Ukraine's success with drones and its growing drone manufacturing sector, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's now capable of building 10 million drones per year with the right investment. NATO may be planning on making that investment. Ukraine would then be drawn into the NATO fold, despite not being a member of the group, which is guaranteed to anger Putin. Via this cooperation with Ukraine, Bloomberg says, NATO might also be able to gain access to interceptor drones that are capable of taking out incoming Russian drones before they hit their targets. These drones cost as little as $500 each, Business Insider reported in October, making them a much more attractive option for a drone wall than the more expensive air defense systems such as the US-made Patriot. Integrating these types of drones into a system that employs sensors and surveillance equipment could be the key to making a drone wall work. What NATO is reportedly proposing in terms of transforming its surveillance drones into attack drones would work within this structure. The proposed drones could pull double duty by identifying and attacking incoming threats, in addition to recording data that other elements of the drone wall could use. However, none of this is confirmed. All we know right now is that NATO is discussing these types of drone-based solutions. Another proposal, according to the Financial Times, involves lowering the bar for NATO's pilots to open fire on any Russian threats that enter NATO territory. This streamlining of pilot instructions would be especially relevant on NATO's eastern flanks, where Russia's hybrid warfare tactics are at their most intense. This is a proposal that has already been doing the rounds within several NATO nations. Poland has already said that it's willing to shoot down any Russian jets that enter its territory, as we discussed in a past video. Check out that video if you want the details about Poland's warning and Russia's response to it. Newsweek also spoke to a NATO official in the wake of the Financial Times report. That official implied that discussions about pilots being given clear instructions on when they can engage Russian threats are ongoing and have been for a while. When it comes to the range of hybrid or grey zone activities we've seen, including cyber attacks, drone incursions, or attempts to sabotage critical infrastructure, NATO is working closely with allies to ensure that we're taking appropriate steps to ensure we can deter and defend. This isn't new, and we continue to adapt as the situation evolves, the official said. Though generic on the surface, we can read a lot into the "this isn't new" aspect of the quote. NATO allies are already talking about using fighter jets to shoot down Russian aerial assets. This official is saying that those kinds of talks are taking place on a much wider scale. Shooting down Russian threats is an approach that has the support of US President Donald Trump, when asked whether NATO nations should do just that when on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September. These calls have also been backed by the European Commission or EC President Ursula von der Leyen. In a September 24th interview with CNN, the EC President said, "My opinion is we have to defend every square centimetre of the territory. That means if there is an intrusion in the airspace, after warning, after being very clear, of course the option of shooting down a fighter jet that is intruding our airspace is on the table." You'll see several caveats in that quote. Warnings, being very clear, whatever that may mean, these are all safeguards against NATO going overboard, but they also serve as aerial red tape that could prevent a member nation from firing when it's within its rights to do so. The Financial Times reports that its sources says that setting and streamlining clear rules of engagement for dealing with Russian aerial assets in NATO airspace is on the agenda for the discussions that are already being held. Another suggestion is one with which Russia will be very familiar: projecting power. Conducting more NATO-led military exercises in regions that border Russia is an option that's currently being discussed. The Financial Times says that these exercises would place a particular focus on the more remote and unguarded parts of the eastern flank. The intended message is clear. It's not just about showcasing how much modern military might NATO could bring to bear if Russia escalated to the point of forcing a direct conflict. But focusing on these previously less guarded regions, NATO also wants to show Putin that the organization has eyes everywhere. Whatever remote regions Russia may have scouted as potential routes of attack will not only be guarded by a drone wall, but they'll be hosting military exercises that make it impossible for Russia to know whether it's safe to take advantage of these regions. This approach could perhaps see NATO's Iron Defender exercise, which is typically led by Poland and involved over 30,000 soldiers in 2025, expanded considerably. Estonia, Latvia, and Finland, all of which are NATO member nations that directly border Russia, could also become the locations for new NATO exercises if the Defense Collective decides to go down this route. Again, we'll point out that discussions are ongoing and they're still in their early stages. NATO's military response to Russia could include some, all, or even none of these ideas. We won't know for sure until the current talks end and action is taken. The Financial Times adds that NATO may not even publicly announce what it intends to do, stating that all 4 of the officials it spoke to said the same thing. There is a certain logic here. Saying less means revealing less. When Russia doesn't know what NATO's full plan is, there's less chance that Putin and his cronies can come up with a counterplan to overcome what NATO does. It's not just NATO that's coming up with ideas on how to deal with Russia's hybrid warfare. The European Union, or EU, is getting in on the act. The EU isn't taking a military approach, as most in the group are part of NATO and likely believe that such direct action is better conducted under the NATO banner. However, as Euronews reported on October 7th, the EU is considering a proposal that would restrict the movements of Russian diplomats across EU territory. This may seem like a small action at first, however it represents a clear drawing of lines, a shift to an us versus them mentality that Russia has had for a long time. With these travel bans, the EU would communicate to Putin and his diplomats that the bloc isn't interested in what Russia has to say anymore. It will only be interested in what Russia does, and it will respond accordingly. We know why NATO and the EU are doing all of this in the direct sense. Russia's hybrid warfare, particularly its recent use of drones and fighter jets, provides more than enough reasons for NATO to consider a military response. However, drilling deeper into the basic answer to why NATO is doing all of this reveals a set of goals that the collective defense organization wants to achieve. The first of those goals is simple: raise the cost of Russia's hybrid warfare campaign. Even all of the methods we've discussed so far wouldn't be enough to stop Russia if it were truly determined to send another drone or jet into NATO airspace. NATO's eastern flank was around 1,550 miles long back in 2022. Finland's ascension to NATO member status added another 830 miles or so to that extensive border with Russia. No matter how complex a drone wall NATO can create, it's almost impossible to watch every mile of the eastern flank. But that's not the point. The real point is to make Russia's hybrid warfare campaign so expensive that Putin has to very carefully consider whether he wants to continue with it. If NATO's pilots are given the green light to shoot down Russian jets in NATO airspace, for instance, that means Russia is risking millions of dollars if it tries to pull the trick it pulled against Estonia again. Military Watch magazine says that a single MiG-31 airframe is valued at over $60 million. Add a trained pilot and whatever weapons that jet is carrying into the mix, and Russia will be taking a massive monetary gamble every time it sends jets into NATO airspace. Sure, the gamble might pay off. The eastern flank is long enough for jets to sneak over and then back again. But that would also eliminate the point of sending them in the first place. Russia wants its jets to be caught in the act because that serves as proof to NATO that Russia can enter its airspace. If those jets are caught and shot down, an intimidation tactic turns into a massive money loser for the Kremlin. And right now, Russia can't afford to lose much more money. Over 3.5 years of attritional warfare in Ukraine have done a real number on Russia's finances. On October 7th, Novaya Gazeta published an article in which it said that Russia's current levels of military spending have already left the country in a catch-22 situation. It points out that Russia has dedicated 38% of its federal budget to military spending up to 2028, which includes over $154 billion earmarked specifically for the Ukraine war. This budget was announced even though several senior Russian officials sounded the alarm at June's St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, telling Putin that his war expenditure was sending Russia headlong into an economic crisis. Stagnation seems to lie in Russia's economic future, and Russia's wartime spending may be even higher than the country has revealed. That's according to Craig Kennedy. In February, Kennedy published a report on Russia's war costs, revealing that Putin has been funding the Ukraine war with off-budget debt. Under legislation enacted in February 2022, the state has taken control of war-related lending at Russia's major banks. It's directing them to extend preferential loans on terms set by the state to a wide range of businesses providing goods and services for the war. Since mid-2022, this state-directed war funding scheme has helped drive a large part of Russia's anomalous 36.6 trillion rubles, $446 billion, surge in overall corporate borrowing, Kennedy writes. He then points to all of these loans as being the main reason why Russia's domestic economy is dealing with high interest rates and soaring inflation. The bottom has to fall out for Russia's economy eventually. NATO plans to show Putin that it'll only add to his country's economic woes if he keeps pushing his luck with his hybrid warfare tactics. Beyond the economic impact, NATO has a second objective with its planned military response: reducing fear. After all, creating fear is the goal for Putin. Going back to what we touched on earlier, Putin wants NATO nations to know that Russia's aerial assets are entering their airspace. Russia is waging a form of psychological warfare, making the nations affected wonder if the next incident is the one where Russia's drones or fighter jets do some serious damage. NATO can never quite be certain if Russia is baiting a response or is about to escalate. It's all about destabilization, as The Guardian's Catherine Butler wrote on October 8th. She says that Russia's hybrid war has started to feel a bit close for comfort for many Europeans, noting that Russia's drones have recently caused issues in Germany and Denmark. A cynic might say that Russia straying beyond the nations that make up the eastern flank may be what has really triggered NATO's current discussions about military actions. Regardless of whether or not that's true, too many NATO nations are starting to feel the fear. The entire point of the collective defense bloc is to eradicate that type of fear, so military actions in response to what Russia is doing seem logical. Of course, we've yet to tackle the biggest question that has arisen from this looming change in NATO's posture. What does Russia think about all of this? To say Putin isn't happy would be an understatement. On October 9th, Le Monde reported that Russia is already threatening what it will only call a significant response to any European nation that continues to support Ukraine. Speaking on October 2nd at a forum in the Black Sea region of Sochi, Putin himself said, "Germany says its army should once again become the strongest in Europe. Let's see what that means. No one should have doubt that Russia's countermeasures will not take a long time to come." Putin went on to claim that Russia has never initiated a military confrontation, which is baffling considering what's happening in Ukraine. He then, as he has so often done, shifted the blame for the Ukraine war onto Europe's shoulders. He cautioned European nations, claiming that their leaders are allowing hysteria over an impending war with Russia to rule their decision-making. These comments may have come before the Financial Times report, but they address the very nations that Russia knows are talking about formulating a military response to what Putin is doing. Russia's propagandists have also gone into overdrive, Le Monde reports. It shares quotes from several of Russia's pro-military Telegram channels. Their focus seems to lie on Russia's shadow fleet, to which European nations have started to pay very close attention. A typical comment comes from the Colonel Kassad Telegram channel, which says, "I'd like to remind you that in response to the capture of Iranian tankers, Tehran captured Western tankers. The West only understands force. They're now testing the limits of what's tolerable. Russia is trying to flip the script. It wasn't Russia's fault that Putin invaded Ukraine. That was all down to Europe and its NATO members. Now it's not Russia that is testing the limits of what's tolerable by sending aerial assets into NATO airspace. NATO is at fault again. It's pushing the boundaries by focusing on shadow fleet vessels that shouldn't be sailing and by considering a military response to Russia's threatening actions. It's all propaganda that's a product of the Kremlin spin machine. And as you might have guessed, the word nuclear has also been mentioned. On September 25th, which was after Russia conducted its hybrid warfare campaigns in Poland and Estonia, and around the time that the idea of shooting down Russian jets first started coming up, a major ally started using the nuclear word. That ally is Sergei Karaganov, who is the honorary chairman of the Russian Council for Foreign and Defense Policy. Speaking about the impact that an attritional war with NATO would have on Russia, Karaganov said, "This European contagion must be eradicated. We need to prepare to strike, or at least make them understand that we are ready. It won't necessarily be a nuclear strike, but we must prepare." He added that a nuclear war with NATO can be won. That kind of major war may be coming. Zelensky has hinted that Putin is considering a new round of military mobilization in Russia that could trigger the kind of war that Karaganov mentions. "If there is mobilization, it will be a challenge to Europe. He will start a major war," Zelensky said on October 8th. Perhaps NATO's ultimate goal with its potential military maneuvers is to prevent tensions from escalating to the point where such a war seems inevitable. Sending decisive messages now that NATO is prepared to take out Russian assets when Putin pushes things too far may be just enough to convince Russia's leader to back off. Or it could be the sort of escalation Putin is looking for to give him an excuse to start a Europe-wide war.
All Vladimir Putin had to do was say yes. Peace was offered to Russia on a silver platter. Even if Putin wasn't ready to declare a full peace, he had the option of a 30-day ceasefire that would have at least put a temporary end to the bleeding that's seen Russia lose more than 1.12 million soldiers since it launched its Ukraine invasion. But Putin rejected peace, repeatedly, and now Ukraine's flying sanctions are making Russia pay by absolutely devastating its economy. It could have all been so different, as the Atlantic Council wrote on October 6. For much of 2025, US President Donald Trump was not only pushing for peace in Ukraine, but to many, he seemed to be taking Putin's side more than Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's side. Even as Putin intensified his invasion and started launching record-breaking numbers of long-range drones and missiles at Ukraine, Trump still tried to offer Russia generous peace terms. Whether Ukraine would have accepted those terms is immaterial. Trump was at least trying to bring Russia's president to the table. Putin was saying all the right words, or so he thought. As the Atlantic Council notes, the Kremlin has often expressed its support for a Trump-led peace effort, albeit always with caveats attached. Yet even as it expressed this support, Putin would play games, delaying talks, refusing to meet Zelensky, saying one thing during meetings and doing the exact opposite on the battlefield. Over the course of 2025, it's become increasingly clear to everyone, and especially Donald Trump, that what Putin says and what he actually does are often two very different things. Putin has proven himself unwilling to compromise on anything. Ukraine must cede territory, including the key regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, Putin contends. He also wants Ukraine to reduce its military to a shell of its current self, which will only make the country easier for Russia to invade again in the future. And as for NATO, Putin is steadfast. Ukraine can't be allowed to join under any circumstances. A man who won't bend at all is not a man with whom a compromise can be made. Putin's demands amount to a rejection of peace. And now it's time to stop playing Putin's games, the Atlantic Council contends. If Putin rejects peace through negotiation, then the only other option is to force him to accept peace through strength. And while the US will play a role in this new approach, as indicated by the Trump administration considering doing things like sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, there is one country that's taking the peace through strength approach to Putin better than anybody else. The country that Putin thought would roll over 3.5 years ago when he first invaded, Ukraine. It's Ukraine that has felt the effects of Putin's refusal to declare peace, with Russia's leader having dangled the carrot in front of Ukraine only to replace that carrot with yet more drones, bombs and soldiers. Ukraine's response, especially during the latter half of 2025, has been the increasing use of its flying sanctions to do more damage to Russia than Putin ever thought possible. Where peace negotiations have failed, Ukraine is putting untold amounts of pressure on Putin. And, as Zelensky recently said during an interview with assorted journalists on October 9, Ukraine is seeing results. United 24 media reported on this interview, noting that Zelensky discussed several key Ukrainian weapon systems and the positive effects they're having in terms of punishing Putin for his refusal to make peace. The first of those weapons has been a headline grabber for Ukraine in the past. Palianitsia is active, and it's striking deep into the heart of Russia's military. There are positive developments. Palianitsia has already begun hitting enemy ammo depots in dozens of cases, Zelensky told journalists. That's a positive development, because there were different situations, and now we're no longer talking about isolated incidents. In other words, Palianitsia is no longer being deployed in isolated cases. It's being used often and well, suggesting that Ukraine is manufacturing the weapon at scale and using it to take out ammunition stockpiles. When ammunition is destroyed before Russia's forces are able to use it, Ukraine's defenders benefit from dealing with weaker Russian assaults that they're more able to counter. Palianitsia has been in the works for a while, though it's only in the last month or so that details about the weapon's capabilities have emerged. It's a rocket drone that was announced on August 24, 2024, which happens to be Ukraine's Independence Day. It wasn't until just over a year later that JSC Ukrainian Defense Industry revealed specifications at the arms exhibition in Poland in September. Palianitsia is a 705-pound drone capable of carrying a 220-pound payload. That puts it a step ahead of many of Ukraine's other long-range drones, such as the Lyuty. Though that drone is impressive in its own right, even the upgraded version only has a 165-pound warhead, meaning Palianitsia can hit a whole lot harder. The range is also on the side of Ukraine's rocket drone. It can travel for up to 403 miles, making a good choice for hitting Russian bases just beyond the border. That's likely why Zelensky mentions using Palianitsia to take out Russian ammunition depots. Those depots would likely have been inside Russia, where Putin may have hoped they would be outside the range of most Ukrainian weapons. The Palianitsia can hit those Russian depots. It's also a difficult rocket drone to stop. Palianitsia can hit a cruising speed of 559 miles per hour, which is not subsonic but still quick enough to make it difficult to shoot down. Plus, it's a drone, which means it flies at a much lower altitude than the missiles that most of Russia's air defenses are designed to take out. The Palinitsya can go as low as 49 feet off the ground, allowing it to stay at the type of altitude that makes it almost impossible for Russia's radars to pick it up. Zelensky says Ukraine has been using this weapon with deadly efficiency to punish Putin for his refusal to make peace. But Palinitsya isn't the only Putin-punishing weapon that Ukraine has in its arsenal. There's also Ruta. Another positive development is Ruta. Our missile drone has for the first time struck a maritime platform at 250 plus kilometers, Zelensky said during his interview. He added that the likes of the Lyuty drone and Ukraine's Firepoint have also been used en masse in a serious operation that involved 300 units. Zelensky continued, stating, "We understand that Uts-Luga and Primorsk are now within reach. What happened, in my view, is really a major success. Both of the locations Ukraine's president mentions are ports that Russia uses to transport oil, either domestically or to other countries. Primorsk is Russia's largest oil terminal on the Baltic Sea," the BBC reported in September in the wake of a Ukrainian strike against the port. The outlet notes that Primorsk is the last station in the Baltic pipeline system, making it vital for Russia's oil exports. That same strike also saw Ukraine hit the Uts-Luga terminal, which is close to Estonia, meaning it also takes advantage of the Baltic Sea to serve as a key part of the supply chain that allows Russia to ship oil in and out of the country. These sorts of attacks help to damage Russia's oil industry, which in turn hurts Russia's economy. But more on that later in the video. Zelensky specifically shouting out Ruta is interesting, as this is a weapon that has perhaps not gained as much attention as the likes of the Lyuty and the Palinitsya drones. Ruta is a missile drone, Defense Express reported in December 2024, and it's a long-range weapon created by a company named Destinus, which was founded by Mikhail Kokorich. That particular man is significant because he fled Putin's Russia before creating his company, making Ruta an example of Ukraine using the ingenuity of a Russian to strike against Putin. The same outlet followed up on its original Ruta report in May, revealing that Ruta has received an upgrade that includes a new navigation system that enables precision strikes. Perhaps it's this upgrade that allowed the drone to score a direct hit on a maritime platform, as Zelensky describes. Not much else is known about the missile drone beyond that. Its range is believed to be 186 miles, which is roughly equivalent to the ATACMS missiles that the US has provided to Ukraine. That makes Ruta a good choice for striking against Russian assets in the Black Sea and Crimea, which is presumably where the maritime platform Zelensky mentions was located. There are no official details about the drone's warhead, though Defense Express claims that experts believe it might carry a warhead equivalent in size to the Palinitsya. And hints are already emerging about how Ukraine is using its flying sanctions to make Putin pay for refusing peace already. With one type of drone, it's taking out Russian ammunition depots, which weakens Putin's forces on the front lines. That amounts to more Russian casualties, which also means more money coming out of the Kremlin budget to pay for new soldiers. Ukraine's attacks on Russia's terminals mean that oil money is in increasingly short supply, while the strikes against maritime platforms further diminish Russia's presence and effectiveness in the Black Sea. Ukraine's main strategy in 2025 has been to bring the war to Russia. Zelensky's comments revealed that it's pulling off that strategy brilliantly. Ukraine's president also confirmed something that's been rumored for a while. Ukraine's Flamingo and Neptune missiles are both active and have been used very recently. And in the past week, I won't give numbers, we've used our Neptune Flamingo pair, Zelensky told journalists. The corresponding results can be analysed independently. We're not talking about en masse use of this pair, we're only saying that it's been used, and there are initial signs of such success with this particular weapon. This is terrible news for Putin. Ukraine's drones pack enough of a punch to cause damage to Russia's military assets and oil refineries. However, Flamingo and Neptune are very different prospects. Both hit much harder than Ukraine's drones, with Flamingo alone carrying a warhead that weighs over 2,500 pounds. That's 10 times the power of the Palinitsya loaded into a missile that can also travel for up to 1,864 miles. The Flamingo and its first usages have been covered in another video, so check that out to learn more about why this particular weapon is the last thing that Russia wants to see Zelensky confirm is in use. Ukraine also has a new version of its Neptune missile, which has been dubbed Puffy Neptune, that is just as dangerous. Again, there's a video you can check out to learn more about that weapon. Both are missiles that have been built in Ukraine and by Ukraine, which is another shot against Putin's peace avoidance strategy. Russia's leader might have hoped that he could still use whatever influence he has with Trump to prevent Ukraine from using the long-range missiles the US provides against Russia. Indeed, that seemed to be the case only a few weeks ago, which is when the Wall Street Journal reported that the US had banned Ukraine from using Western missiles in Russia by creating an approval process that delivered a no every time Ukraine asked. With Flamingo and Neptune, Ukraine doesn't have to ask permission anymore. It can hit Russia as often as it's able to build these powerful new weapons. Ultimately, it's the use of long-range strikes, made possible by all of the weapons Zelensky mentioned, and more, that have been Ukraine's true punishment for Putin. Each is a flying sanction that damages a specific part of the Russian war machine, and nowhere has Russia felt the full force of Ukraine taking matters into its own hands than in its oil industry. Ukraine has devastated Russia's oil refining. Gasoline shortages are now running rampant in Russia, as Zelensky explained. Ukraine is achieving truly significant things, and our long-range sanctions against Russia clearly demonstrate this, Zelensky said. According to our data, the fuel shortage in Russia is already approaching 20%. This figure refers specifically to gasoline, though Russia's supply of diesel is also being affected. Diesel shortages aren't happening inside Russia yet. However, Zelensky says that Russia is being forced to dip into diesel stockpiles that it was saving for a rainy day. Russia is feeling the domestic chaos caused by this fuel shortage. RBC Ukraine provides more details. It notes that 5 Russian regions have been forced to implement restrictions on gasoline sales to customers. Crimea is one of those regions, which may add some context to the use of Ruta, which likely struck a maritime platform in or near the peninsula. The other 4 affected regions are Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, and Tyumen. The latter is especially notable because it's home to a large Russian oil refinery that Ukraine targeted on Putin's birthday earlier in October. Russia might try to claim that Ukraine's long-range strikes aren't effective. A region that's home to a refinery experiencing a gasoline shortage suggests that they are. In almost all cases, Russia's gasoline customers are being restricted to just 30 litres of gasoline per customer. That's nowhere near enough to fill a tank in most modern cars, which makes long journeys a dicey proposition for Russian motorists who live in the world's largest country. RBC Ukraine adds that 360 gas stations in Russia were forced to shut down in August and September. This only amounts to 1 in every 50 of Russia's gas stations, but it's still a significant number that indicates how Russia is having a very hard time keeping its gasoline-based businesses supplied. Russia has a couple of solutions to this fuel shortage problem. Neither is great for the country. As a short-term measure, Russia has been forced to import fuel from other nations to keep its domestic market ticking over. This situation highlights the economic impact of Ukraine's long-range strikes come into play. Imported fuel costs more for Russia than the fuel it makes for itself, meaning Ukraine's drones are forcing Russia into paying for the product for which it's most famous. For example, regarding imports, we already have some data. They're importing from Belarus and China. Imports from Belarus have increased 6-fold, and they removed import duties, Zelensky recently told reporters. Though Ukraine's president added that this information needed to be verified, several media outlets have reported the same thing before Zelensky shared this information. One of those outlets is the Moscow Times, which claimed on October 8 that Russia's imports of Belarusian gasoline surged 4-fold in September when compared to its August imports. Russia bought 49,000 tons of gasoline from Belarus in September, the outlet reports, in addition to purchasing 33,000 tons of diesel. The same outlet notes Ukraine's strikes against Russia's refineries are the likely reason for these purchases, adding that Ukraine has hit about a third of Russia's refineries in August and September alone. Oilprice.com also reported on Russia's rising gasoline imports on October 2, noting that the country is planning to buy more of the product from China, Singapore, and South Korea. In all cases, Russia will be waiving the 5% duty it usually places on fuel imports, which is another blow to its economy. That's less money heading into the collective Russian bank account that it might have been used to fund the Ukraine war. Russia must be getting desperate if it's willing to waive this duty just to keep gasoline flowing to its domestic pumps. And if any more evidence were needed that Ukraine's long-range strikes are having the desired effect, all anyone has to do is look at Russia's gasoline exports. There aren't any. They have a ban on gasoline exports and restrictions on diesel exports, Zelensky told reporters. This still needs to be verified, but we believe that they've lost up to 20% of their gasoline supply, directly as a result of our strikes. Again, several outlets have confirmed these bans. On September 30, the Moscow Times reported that Russia has extended an already existing ban on gasoline exports to the end of 2025, with the ban applying to all exporters, including gasoline producers. Diesel exports are prohibited from being sold abroad by resellers, the same outlet notes. This means that a company that previously bought diesel with the intention of shipping it overseas can't do that anymore. Russia wants full control over its diesel sales, suggesting that it's preparing for a possible future where it won't be able to sell that fuel either. By the way, the diesel restrictions also apply to several of Russia's other refined oil products, including marine fuel. The diesel restrictions aren't a massive blow to Russia's fuel producers. No more than 2% of Russia's diesel is sold by resellers, so perhaps these restrictions shouldn't be taken as a sign that Russia is on the verge of a diesel crisis on a similar scale to its gasoline predicament. However, anything that Russia does to restrict its own oil sales will always have a knock-on effect on the country's economy. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies explains why. It says that revenue generated from Russia's oil and gas industries accounts for anywhere between 30 and 50% of the country's total budget revenues for any given year. Typically, these industries also account for about 20% of Russia's gross domestic product. The genius of Ukraine's punishment for Putin's refusal to accept a peace deal is that it's gradually taking away the one Russian product that it knows is in high demand. Right now, most of the impact is being felt in Russia's domestic market. Gasoline isn't readily available anymore, with shortages also leading to price increases that will sting Russians living in a country that had an 8.1% inflation rate in August and has seen inflation rise above 10% for several months in 2025. If Ukraine can maintain the pressure by taking out even more of Russia's oil, the export bans that are temporary right now might become more permanent. That means less money flowing into Russia. Taking out oil terminals contributes to these export problems and could even lead to Russia struggling to import fuel. Plus, every strike on a Russian military asset, such as the ammunition depots Zelensky mentioned, means more money is being spent on a war when Russia's cash reserves are slowly running out. Putin could have avoided all of this if he'd just agreed to a peace deal, but he said no, and Ukraine's flying sanctions are making Russia pay the price. In early 2022, when Russian President Vladimir Putin gave the order for his army to invade Ukraine, he could never have expected how the following years would pan out. Putin likely predicted a quick, crushing defeat, thanks to his country's enormous advantages in terms of manpower and military equipment. He envisioned Russian troops raising the country's flag over Kyiv and the Russian population proclaiming him as their greatest ever leader. Instead, his plan backfired in ways he can barely comprehend. He wanted to crush Ukraine. Instead, he turned it into a major military superpower. Back in 2022, Ukraine was not in any way a major player in the military sector. That's not to say it didn't have some interesting military projects in development and accomplishments to be proud of. It developed the now well-known R-360 Neptune missile, for example, which has since gone on to modify in various ways and deploy against numerous Russian targets. It also had a reasonably strong military force to defend its territory, should the need ever arise, and old stocks of Soviet-era tanks and other weaponry to call on. However, it was not one of the first countries that would have sprung to mind when talking about the world's best missile programs or military innovations. Nor would it have been listed among the most resilient and tactically adept armed forces on the planet. But that's all changed. Now, Ukraine absolutely is in the discussions when listing world-leading militaries. It's the pioneer, the benchmark, the example for countless other nations around the world to follow, and even major established military powers in Europe and beyond are looking at Ukraine to lead and guide them in strengthening their own defenses. Ukraine's tremendous transformation is entirely due to the amazing efforts of its people and various military branches, manufacturers, and other related entities. It's a story of overcoming the odds, of adapting in the face of adversity, of not backing down but rising up, and it all began on February 24, 2022, when those first Russian troops crossed over the border and dared to threaten the territory of the Ukrainian people. Since that date, Ukraine's defense sector has seen a staggering 350% growth, as detailed in a recent in-depth report for the Jamestown Foundation by Taras Kuzio, professor of political science at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and associate research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, a London-based think tank. In his report, Professor Kuzio also noted that 2023 to 2024 was a particularly impactful year for Ukraine, with defense investment rising by a staggering 900%, with estimates putting the exact amount somewhere between $35 and $50 million. This just shows just how much money and growth the Ukrainian defense sector has experienced in recent years, with the industry effectively rising up and almost quadrupling in size in the last 3.5 years, as only 26% of Ukraine's current defense companies actually operated prior to 2022. That kind of growth is unprecedented, and it shows just how incredibly well Ukraine's engineers, developers, military experts, and innovators have responded to the invasion. They could have cowered in fear, they could have rolled over and submitted to the invaders, waving the white flag in the face of a much larger and stronger force. Instead, they stood firm. They fought back, dug in, and worked tirelessly to find new ways to defend themselves, investing in everything from drone technology to artificial intelligence, tank armor, missile systems, and so much more. And, as Professor Kuzio puts it, this growth is only going to continue for as long as the war wages on. Growth of Ukraine's defense sector will continue because Russia's maximalist goals have not changed and international attempts at brokering peace have failed. This is the tragic but true state of the war today. While various nations and world leaders, including US President Donald Trump, have pushed for peace and a ceasefire between Kyiv and Moscow, the war seems no closer to ending today than it did a year or two ago. Even though Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has shown a real willingness to bring the conflict to a close, his Russian counterpart Putin has done the exact opposite. He's repeatedly said one thing but done another, discussing peace agreements with Trump one moment but launching a record-level drone and missile attacks on Kyiv the next. Putin's words and actions make his position clear. Earlier this year, he notably stated that Ukraine belonged to Russia. I've said many times that I consider the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to be one people. In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours. We have an old rule: wherever a Russian soldier sets foot is ours. Putin has also remained steadfast in his commitment to continue the war, no matter what. Even as his country's economy crumbles and his troops struggle to make gains along the front lines with dramatic losses of life and equipment, still he pushes on, saying, "Our troops are advancing along the entire line of contact, every day more or less, but every day they go forward and the advance will continue." For as long as that advance goes on, for as long as Russian forces continue to invade Ukraine, steal its land and kill its people, the Ukrainian people will be forced to defend themselves. And in order to defend themselves, their defense sector will continue to create, innovate, and astound the world with its efficiency and unique ability to develop extraordinary weaponry and defenses, often on tight budgets and in remarkably short time spans. This is vital, not only for Ukraine, but for the whole of Europe and the future prospects of peace around the world. As EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas notes,
"It is clear that Russia shows no wish to end this war. For Europe, this can only mean one thing: more military, diplomatic and economic support to Ukraine. And in the event of truce, a strong Ukrainian military is the strongest security guarantee there is, and that's why we are also supporting them with training, funding and equipment."
Thankfully, Ukraine's military is in a stronger position today than it has ever been, and there are numerous stats to back this up. In regard to drone warfare, for example, Ukraine is now the biggest producer of tactical and long-range drones on the planet. When the war ends, it will be seen as the drone capital of the world, and countless other armies across the globe will be looking towards Kyiv to either purchase drones or learn more about how to make their own and how to effectively use them in the field of battle. And Ukraine's forces have unparalleled experience in this domain because drones have come to dominate this war more than any other weapon or piece of military equipment. it didn't start off that way, with Russia originally relying on more conventional means of warfare, like tanks and armoured vehicles, to overwhelm its opposition. But as the months and years went by and the tanks proved increasingly ineffective, Russia turned to drones, firing them with increasing frequency towards Ukraine's towns and cities. Charts tracking this year's Russian drone attacks showed just how big they've become. The Kremlin used to launch dozens of UAVs over the borders and into Ukraine. Now, it regularly sends hundreds of them, with one recent record-setting attack involving more than 820 drones in total. Ukraine has had to find ways to deal with that, but it's also found the time to develop its own drones and master its own form of drone warfare too, a form that, in many ways, is far more effective than Russia's. Because Russia's tactics rely primarily on brute force. That's why it keeps on breaking its own records and sending larger and larger swarms into Ukraine. It knows that the vast majority will be shot down, since the Ukrainian armed forces have such impressive and effective air defense systems in place far and wide across their land. But Russia also knows that some drones will be able to bypass those defenses and deal damage to its targets, which include everything from hospitals and schools to residential homes and power stations. Ukraine, meanwhile, uses drones much more efficiently, precisely, and carefully. It doesn't follow the wasteful model of its opponent, nor does it commit war crimes by launching drones at completely innocent civilians on a regular basis, like Russia does. Instead, it picks and chooses its targets with care and plans its attacks with precision, regularly taking out the pieces of infrastructure that matter the most to the Kremlin, launching attacks that have the best chances of bringing the war to a speedy conclusion. It has, for example, recently focused its strikes on the likes of oil refineries and fuel storage facilities, triggering a massive fuel crisis that's spreading like wildfire around Russia at this very moment. And Ukrainian drones are getting smarter and deadlier by the day. As Professor Kuzio's report notes, from 2025 and into 2026, the country is set to shift from the traditional one drone one operator model of drone warfare to AI-driven drone swarms with the power to operate autonomously without the need for much or any human control or intervention. This will change the state of the war even further, as AI-powered drones won't be subject to the same risks or challenges as conventional models. They won't be so easily taken out by jammers and electronic warfare measures, for example, so can more easily bypass enemy defenses and strike their targets, and there's no telling how Ukraine's armed forces could use this kind of technology to deal far more devastating blows to whatever's left of Russia's energy infrastructure. Ukraine has also changed the game in the missile sector. It started the war with little more than old Soviet stocks and its Neptune anti-ship missiles. It's since gone on to create several variants of the Neptune, including one that can carry out attacks on land-based targets to strike Russian radars, air defenses, airfields and infrastructure, plus the Long Neptune, a long-range variant that can travel over 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers, bringing countless new locations deep into Russia within range. Ukraine also recently unveiled its Sapsan missile, the first ballistic missile to be made within Ukraine, capable of traveling 4 times faster than the speed of sound, as well as the Flamingo, boasting a jaw-dropping range of more than 1,800 miles. On top of all these achievements in drones and missiles, Ukraine has brought numerous additional innovations to the table, from AI-powered air defense turrets to special armor add-on packages that make tanks and armored vehicles more resilient in the field. These kinds of advancements are made possible because of 2 major factors. The first is the immense investment and financial aid provided by Ukraine's many important allies around the world, particularly those in Europe and the NATO alliance. This funding, provided through initiatives like the ERA Loans for Ukraine program, allows Kyiv's defense contractors and companies to continue their research and development efforts. The second is the fact that the Ukrainian government is so willing to support and foster innovation. It set up the Brave One platform, for example, which provides support for around 1,500 technical companies in the form of $30 million in grants. Brave One has helped in the creation of several vital technologies that are being used in the war today, including interceptor drones that can find and take out Russian reconnaissance drones, making it harder for the Russian forces to gain intelligence and plan their attacks. More than 200 AI-driven innovations are being supported by Brave One 2, covering everything from AI analysis of photos and videos captured by UAVs to advanced military intelligence systems powering the drones of tomorrow. What's more, the platform supports around 140 electronic warfare manufacturers, many of whom are not merely making products to serve Ukraine today, but designing them in accordance with NATO standards too, so that they could be easily sold and deployed in other nations in the future. And it's extremely likely that many nations will indeed be negotiating with Kyiv in the coming years to procure some Ukrainian drone technologies of their own, because nobody, not even the United States, can rival Ukraine at the moment in this sector. As Nathan Mintz, co-founder of the Californian defense company CX2, told the Wall Street Journal, no US company is keeping up with Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal also revealed that US drones have been sent to Ukraine but often failed to deliver results. Many US companies that brought drones to Ukraine watched them fall out of the sky or failed to complete missions. Given that the US leads the way in almost all military aspects, this just goes to show what an extraordinary job Ukraine is doing, as it's even ahead of America in regard to drone warfare. Ukraine has also become less reliant on weapons systems from allies as the war has progressed. Early on, it desperately needed the likes of missiles and anti-tank weapons from supporting nations like the US and the United Kingdom. But over time, it's focused more and more on building up its domestic projects and production capacities. Now, Ukraine produces 60% of the equipment used by its armed forces, so only a minority comes from other nations. It also makes more artillery shells than the whole of the NATO alliance, as well as Europe. Its production rates have risen across the board, with anti-tank weapons up by 100%, ammunition by 150%, artillery by 200%, and armored personnel carriers by an astonishing 400%. As a specific example of this rise in action, Ukraine made just one Bodano howitzer back in 2022. Now, in 2025, it makes 20 of them every single month. What's even more impressive is that Ukraine is able to produce weapons like these faster and more cost effectively than other nations. It can deliver howitzers in 60 days for only $2.5 million per unit, compared to a cost of $4.3 million in Western nations, and delays often lasting not just months but several years. This is partly due to the fact that most of Ukraine's defense sector is made up of private companies that can operate with a strong degree of flexibility and freedom. Bureaucracy is kept to a minimum, and everything is designed with the battlefield in mind, so there aren't usually extensive phases of prototyping, testing, and refining. Products are simply made and rolled out, ready to use against the Russians. This is a stark contrast to the state-dominated military-industrial complexes that exist in other nations like Russia, which can lead to production delays and reams of unnecessary red tape. There are more than 500 private defense companies in Ukraine today, mostly working with parts produced domestically, forming an enclosed ecosystem that gets things done cheaply and smartly, with rapid innovation and zero government interference. The results of this are clear to see, and there are countless examples of exciting and ambitious Ukrainian defense startups churning out amazing equipment in next to no time. Maxon Systems, for instance, needed just 7 months to launch itself as a business and construct an anti-drone interceptor costing around $3,500. Ukraine also set up its Defense Procurement Agency, AOZ, in January 2024 as the only organization within the Ministry of Defense tasked with procuring equipment for the armed forces. This too helped to slash bureaucracy massively and expedite the flow of new weapons and systems from private companies into the hands of Ukrainian soldiers. All in all, Ukraine has set an amazing example here, and one that many other nations may wish to follow. In the harsh realities of a real-world war, it didn't have time to sit around waiting months or years to make and test new weapons before using them. It needed to cut out the middlemen and fast-track the process, and that's exactly what it did. Now, it boasts some of the most impressive military manufacturers on the planet, including world-leading drone creators such as Skyfall, maker of the infamous Vampire or Baba Yaga drone, and TAF, which produces the Calibri 7 and 8 drones. And as Ukraine's defense industry grows, the country is also forming increasingly important and valuable partnerships with major powers around the world. The US, for example, is investing heavily in Ukrainian defenses, preparing a $100 billion deal with Kyiv in exchange for ownership rights of certain Ukrainian military technologies. It's the first time that the US has ever purchased military hardware from a non-NATO state. America's Department of Defense has also worked out contracts with 2 US-Ukrainian partners for the development of long-range drones, while NASA has reached out and acquired Ukrainian robots created by the company Drone UA. The company's co-founder and managing partner, Valery Yakovenko, says that this shows how Ukraine has now become a global technology pioneer. Testing our solutions in the United States paves the way for lasting collaboration with NASA. This proves that Ukrainian innovations are shaping the future. Europe, too, is continuously looking for ways to invest in and learn from Ukraine's burgeoning defense industry. In many ways, Ukraine is now the continent's first and most vital line of defense, creating and testing the military equipment that may be needed in years to come to protect the continent from future Russian aggression. The EU has therefore set up initiatives like the aforementioned ERA loans and the Security Action for Europe SAFE framework to support Ukraine however it can, with European leaders, governments and private companies all reaching out and building connections with the Ukrainian defense sector. The Nordic and Baltic nations have been particularly active in engaging with Ukraine and supporting its defense companies, with Ukraine outsourcing some of its military production to locations within Denmark and Norway, for example. But even further west, countries like Germany, France and the UK have all shown real eagerness to partner with and learn from Ukraine, and there are now more than 40 Western defense companies working directly with Ukraine. That includes some of the biggest names in the business, like Lockheed Martin from the US, Rheinmetall from Germany, and Thales from France. With every passing day, Ukraine's defense industry is growing stronger and more valuable. It's building bridges with allies and investors around the world. It's setting examples that even major military nations are eager to emulate, and it's rolling out innovations faster and more effectively than anyone else in the world. It's a genuine force to be reckoned with, and it was all forged in the fire of this war with Russia. Putin wanted to weaken Ukraine and see the country crumble under the Kremlin's boot. Instead, he woke a sleeping giant, turning a nation that may have once seemed quite small and fragile into one of the strongest military superpowers of our time. Now, learn more about some of Ukraine's recent defense innovations in our videos looking at the ultra-long-range Flamingo missile, which not only brings Moscow into range, but could also strike targets even deeper into Russia, and the mysterious new Puffy Neptune, which is believed to have even greater range than the original, opening up new targets and lines of attack for Kyiv's frontline forces. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can be among the first to find out about Ukraine's new innovations and tactical successes, as well as other important news and developments from this conflict and others around the world.